Welcome in, my beautiful Aries. I'm really glad you're here. Because there's something about this energy that feels impossible to ignore. It doesn't feel quiet anymore. It doesn't feel like someone is successfully pushing their feelings aside and pretending everything is fine. What I'm picking up feels much stronger than that. It feels like somebody has reached a point where staying silent is becoming harder than speaking. And as I begin laying these cards out, Aries, I have to tell you, the energy coming through is intense. The first card that catches my attention is the Judgment card. And the thing is, this doesn't feel sudden. It feels like something that has been building beneath the surface for a very long time. You know when someone keeps talking themselves out of something? They tell themselves it's not the right time. They tell themselves they're over it. They tell themselves they've moved on. But every time they try to close the door, something pulls their attention right back. That's what this feels like. I keep getting the sense that this person has spent a lot of time trying to understand what they're feeling about you. Not because the feelings weren't there. The feelings were always there. The confusion came from what those feelings meant. Because once they acknowledged them, they couldn't pretend anymore. And that's where things get interesting. The Judgment card keeps bringing me back to someone having a moment of clarity about their own heart. Not your heart. Theirs. It's almost like they're finally hearing themselves tell the truth. And for some reason, Aries, that truth keeps leading back to you. Okay. Then I see the Eight of Wands, and immediately the pace changes. Everything feels faster, almost restless. Like someone who can no longer sit comfortably inside their own thoughts. I don't know why, but I keep picturing someone picking up their phone and putting it back down. Typing something, deleting it, rewriting it, second-guessing it, walking away, coming back again. There's nervous energy all around this, not because they don't care. Actually, the opposite. Because they care more than they're comfortable admitting. For some of you, this person has been watching from a distance, not in a dramatic way, more like checking in, wondering, thinking, trying to figure out where you are emotionally, trying to understand whether there's still space for them in your world. And I keep getting this feeling that the more they try to move away from these thoughts, the stronger they become. Like every road somehow circles back to Aries, then the Ace of Swords appears, and wow, this card changes the atmosphere completely. Because now we're moving beyond feelings. Now we're moving toward truth. I keep hearing the words, I need to tell them. Whatever this person has been carrying, it feels heavy. Not because it's dark, not because it's terrible, but because it's been unspoken. You know, sometimes the hardest thing isn't feeling something. It's admitting it. It's allowing another person to see what's really happening inside you. And I feel like that's exactly where this person is standing. Right at the edge of honesty. There's something they've been rehearsing in their mind. A conversation, a confession, an explanation. Maybe several of them, and every time they imagine speaking those words, they get nervous. Because once those words leave their mouth, they become real. And I don't think that's something they've been ready for until recently. What stands out to me is that they're not only thinking about what they want to say, they're thinking about how you'll respond, how you'll look at them, whether you'll understand, whether you'll see past their mistakes, their hesitation, or whatever caused the distance in the first place. And Aries, the final card sitting here is the Knight of Wands. And this energy feels impossible to miss. Because unlike everything we've seen before, this card doesn't feel passive. It feels like movement. It feels like somebody getting tired of standing still. Somebody getting tired of watching life happen from the sidelines. There's something about this person that feels caught between fear and determination. Part of them still worries. Part of them still questions. But another part of them is becoming much louder. A part that keeps saying, enough, enough waiting, enough overthinking, enough wondering what could happen. I keep coming back to the feeling that this person has reached a crossroads inside themselves, because the version of them that wanted to avoid this connection is getting harder to maintain, and the version of them that wants to step closer keeps growing stronger. The cards aren't showing me somebody who has all the answers. They're showing me somebody whose emotions are becoming impossible to ignore. And Aries, as I sit with this energy, I can't help but feel like there's still another layer underneath all of this. Because the more these cards unfold, the more it feels like this isn't only about feelings. It's about something in this person's life that may be changing at the same time. Something they're being asked to leave behind before they can fully step toward what their heart has been trying to tell them all along. There's a heaviness around this person that feels very different from simple hesitation. What I'm noticing is that they're carrying something they've been carrying for a long time, and lately it feels like the weight of it has become impossible to ignore. The Ten of Wands is sitting here, and I can't stop looking at it. Not because of what it traditionally represents, but because of how it feels in this story. It feels exhausting. Like someone who has spent years trying to be the version of themselves that everyone else expected them to be. Someone who kept saying yes when they wanted to say no. Someone who kept choosing comfort over honesty because honesty would have changed everything. And the thing is, Aries, people can live that way for a surprisingly long time. They can convince themselves they're fine. They can build routines around unhappiness. They can learn how to function inside situations that no longer fit them. But eventually something starts happening inside. A quiet voice gets louder. A feeling they used to ignore keeps showing up. A question they've been avoiding starts demanding an answer. I keep getting the sense that this person has reached that place. For some of you, this may not only involve your connection with them. It feels bigger than that. It feels like they're looking at multiple parts of their life and realizing that some things no longer belong in the future they're trying to create. Okay, the Death card appears beside the Ten of Wands, and suddenly the atmosphere shifts. Not in a dramatic way, not in a reckless way. More like someone standing in front of an old photograph and realizing they don't recognize the person they used to be. I don't know why that image keeps coming through, but it feels important, because what I'm picking up isn't somebody losing themselves. It's somebody outgrowing an old identity, the version of them that once needed approval, the version of them that cared too much about what other people would think, the version of them that kept making choices based on expectations instead of truth. Something about that version is becoming harder to maintain. And I think that's uncomfortable for them, because growth sounds exciting until it starts asking you to let go of familiar things. Sometimes people stay where they are not because they're happy there. They stay because it's predictable, because they know what happens tomorrow, because uncertainty feels frightening. Yet this person keeps looking towards something they can't stop thinking about, something that feels more real than what they've been settling for. And every time they try to dismiss it, it comes back stronger. You know, there's something about this energy that reminds me of someone standing at the edge of a doorway. One foot inside the life they've always known. One foot reaching towards something completely different. And the longer they stand there, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Because eventually a choice has to be made. The tower arrives, and wow, this doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like revelation. Like something suddenly becoming impossible to deny. I keep getting the feeling that circumstances around this person are beginning to expose truths they've been avoiding. Truths about themselves, truths about what they really want, truths about relationships, responsibilities, obligations, and expectations they've been carrying. For some of you, it feels like they're discovering that certain foundations in their life were never as solid as they appeared. And that's unsettling, because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. Once a truth enters the room, pretending becomes exhausting. What stands out to me is that this person doesn't seem angry. They seem tired. Tired of performing. Tired of pretending. Tired of carrying stories that no longer reflect who they are becoming. There's almost a sadness here. Not because they're moving forward, but because moving forward sometimes means admitting how much time was spent moving in the wrong direction. And that's not an easy thing to face, especially for someone who has invested years into maintaining a particular image or path. The cards keep drawing my attention toward a moment of internal honesty, a private moment, one that probably happens when nobody else is around. A moment where this person looks at their life and quietly admits something they've never fully admitted before. And Aries, I feel like that realization changes everything. Because once it happens, the Fool appears, and this energy feels completely different. Lighter, softer, almost surprising after everything we've just seen. It's like watching someone take their first full breath after being underwater too long. Not because all the problems disappear, they don't, but because something inside finally says, I can't keep living this way. I keep picking up excitement mixed with fear, hope mixed with uncertainty. This person doesn't seem to know exactly where the road leads. What they do know is that standing still no longer feels possible. And that's important because for a long time, standing still may have felt safer. For a long time, avoiding difficult choices may have felt easier. For a long time, keeping everyone else comfortable may have seemed like the right thing to do. But something is changing. The energy feels less concerned with pleasing everyone and more concerned with being authentic. More concerned with listening to what their own heart has been trying to say. And honestly, that shift feels bigger than they realize. Because the more these cards unfold, the more it feels like they're approaching a moment where they'll have to stop asking themselves what other people want and start asking what they truly want for themselves. Something about the way they're looking at you feels completely different now. Not because you've suddenly changed, not because you've become someone else. What stands out to me is that they're finally seeing things they overlooked before. The Queen of Wands is sitting here, and I can't stop staring at her energy. There's a confidence surrounding you in these cards that doesn't feel loud. It doesn't feel like someone trying to prove anything. It feels natural, comfortable. Like you've reached a place where you no longer need everybody to understand your worth in order to recognize it yourself. And oddly enough, that's exactly what seems to be catching this person's attention. Because there was a time when they thought they had more time. More time to figure things out, more time to decide what they wanted, more time to explore every possibility before making a choice. But something has shifted. I keep getting the feeling that they're realizing life doesn't always wait for people to feel ready. Sometimes opportunities change, people change, circumstances change, and suddenly something that felt permanent begins to look fragile. The Queen of Wands keeps showing me someone they admire, someone they respect, someone they can't quite stop thinking about. And what makes this interesting is that I don't think they expected to feel this way. For some of you, this person may have spent a long time convincing themselves that they could keep emotional distance, that they could remain logical, detached, in control. Yet every attempt to create that distance seems to have brought them right back to the same realization. Aries continues to stand out, not because you're demanding attention, but because your presence has become impossible for them to compare to anyone else. Okay, the Six of Cups appears here, and immediately the atmosphere softens, not in a romantic movie kind of way, not in a fantasy. It feels more personal than that, like memories quietly resurfacing when nobody asked them to. A song they hear unexpectedly, a familiar phrase, a place, a conversation, a laugh they suddenly remember while doing something completely unrelated. You know those moments where a memory shows up out of nowhere and catches you off guard? That's what this feels like. I don't think they're intentionally trying to revisit the past. I think the past keeps finding them. And what's fascinating is that the memories they're revisiting don't seem connected to grand events. The cards keep showing small moments, simple moments, the way you made them feel comfortable, the way conversations flowed naturally, the way they didn't have to pretend around you. I keep getting that. This feeling of emotional ease, because some connections challenge people, some connections excite people, but there are rare connections that make people feel understood, and that's the feeling these cards keep bringing forward. For some reason, they're beginning to realize how unusual that actually was. The sun comes out and everything feels brighter, not because all questions disappear, not because every obstacle vanishes, but because confusion seems to be losing its grip. The more I sit with this energy, the more it feels like this person is having a series of realizations. Not one dramatic revelation, several smaller ones. The kind that arrive quietly. The kind that change your perspective little by little until one day you look at something familiar and see it completely differently. I feel like they're looking back at certain situations involving you and understanding them from a new angle. Things they misunderstood, moments they misread, intentions they questioned. It's almost like pieces of a puzzle are fitting together in ways they never expected. And there's something emotional about that, because clarity can be beautiful, but clarity can also bring regret, especially when it reveals opportunities that weren't fully appreciated at the time. There's a quiet sadness attached to this realization, not overwhelming sadness, just the awareness that some things deserved more attention than they received. And Aries, I don't think this person likes admitting that, because it requires humility. It requires them to acknowledge that maybe they didn't see everything clearly before. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were listening to voices that had no real understanding of what was happening between the two of you. The Strength card arrives, and this energy feels deeply personal, not dramatic, not performative, personal. I feel like this person has spent a lot of time fighting with themselves, trying to suppress certain emotions, trying to stay practical, trying to maintain control over situations that ultimately couldn't be controlled. But the longer they resisted what they felt, the more exhausted they became. There's something about strength here that feels connected to vulnerability. And that's interesting, because many people think strength means never showing emotion, never admitting fear, never admitting uncertainty. Yet these cards are showing someone discovering a different kind of courage. The courage to be honest with themselves. The courage to stop running from questions they've been avoiding. The courage to admit that someone matters more than they originally wanted them to. I keep getting the feeling that they're seeing you through a much more human lens now. Not through assumptions, not through expectations, not through fears, just as you are. And the more clearly they see you, the harder it becomes to ignore what they've learned. Because this isn't only about attraction. It isn't only about emotion. It's about value. It's about realizing the difference between what looked important and what actually was important. And somewhere inside this shift, I feel another layer beginning to emerge, a layer connected to something they've never fully shared, something they've carried privately, because the cards are starting to pull my attention toward a conversation that feels deeper than simple feelings. A conversation where truth begins to take center stage. There's a quiet tension surrounding these cards that feels impossible to overlook. Not the kind of tension that comes from conflict, not the kind that comes from anger. This feels like the tension that builds when somebody has been holding back words for far too long. The moon is the first card pulling my attention, and immediately I get the feeling that there are layers here that have never fully been spoken aloud. Not because this person wanted to deceive you. Not because everything was a lie. It feels more complicated than that. It feels like someone who didn't know how to explain what was happening inside them while it was happening. You know, some people can talk about their emotions easily. They can sit down, have a conversation, and tell you exactly where they stand. But this person doesn't feel like that. This feels like somebody who processes things internally, somebody who retreats into their own thoughts, somebody who spends more time analyzing their feelings than expressing them. And because of that, entire chapters remained hidden, not intentionally hidden, just buried beneath uncertainty, fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. I keep getting the sense that there were moments when they wanted to say something, moments when they almost opened up, moments when the truth was right there on the edge of being spoken. Yet every time they got close, something pulled them back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of rejection. Maybe it was fear of changing everything once those words left their mouth. Whatever the reason, silence became easier than vulnerability, at least for a while. The interesting thing is that silence has a way of creating its own weight. What isn't said doesn't disappear. It lingers. It grows. It follows people into quiet moments when there are no distractions left. And I feel like that's exactly where this person has been spending a lot of time lately. Alone with thoughts they've avoided for longer than they care to admit. The High Priestess appears beside the moon, and honestly, this combination feels incredibly private. Like there are things they've never shared with anyone. Not just you, anyone. Parts of their story they've carried by themselves. Parts of their past that shaped the way they approached relationships, trust, intimacy, and emotional risk. I keep hearing the phrase, "You never knew the whole story." And what's fascinating is that I don't think they're angry about being misunderstood. I think they're beginning to understand why it happened. Because when people keep certain parts of themselves hidden, they unintentionally create distance. Others can only understand the pieces they're allowed to see. And for a long time, this person only showed fragments, never the full picture. Never the fears, never the doubts, never the deeper reasons behind certain choices. There's something humbling happening here, almost like they're looking back and realizing how much they expected others to understand without ever explaining themselves. And Aries, I think that realization is becoming difficult to ignore. The cards keep showing me someone revisiting old conversations in their head, replaying situations, looking at moments from a different perspective, not because they want to live in the past, because they're finally ready to understand it. Okay, the Ace of Swords enters the spread, and the energy changes immediately. The atmosphere becomes clearer, more direct, more intentional. I keep getting this feeling that a decision is forming, not a rush decision, not an emotional reaction, a conscious decision, the kind that develops slowly after months of reflection. Because there comes a point when carrying a secret becomes harder than revealing it. There comes a point when uncertainty becomes more painful than honesty. And I feel like this person is approaching that realization. What stands out to me isn't what they want to say. It's why they want to say it. This doesn't feel like somebody trying to impress you. It doesn't feel like somebody trying to manipulate a situation. It feels like somebody becoming tired of hiding behind unfinished sentences and half-spoken truths. There's a sincerity here that wasn't fully present before. A willingness to be seen without controlling every outcome. And that's a vulnerable place to stand. Especially for someone who has spent so much time protecting themselves. I keep picking up nervous energy around communication, not fear of speaking, fear of being understood. Because once they explain certain things, once they tell you what was really happening behind the scenes, they lose control over how it's received. And that's uncomfortable. Yet despite that discomfort, the cards keep showing movement toward honesty rather than away from it. Which tells me something important is shifting. Judgment appears again. And wow. This card feels completely different here than it did before. Now it feels personal, almost intimate. like someone standing in front of their own reflection and refusing to look away. No excuses, no distractions, no blame, just honesty. The kind of honesty that begins inside before it's ever shared with another person. I think this person has been confronting parts of themselves they once avoided, questions they once ignored, choices they once justified. And because of that, they're beginning to see certain situations with remarkable clarity. There's a strong feeling here that they want you to understand something, not necessarily agree with it, not necessarily approve of it, understand it, because those are two very different things. I don't think they're looking for perfection anymore. I think they're looking for truth. And the more these cards unfold, the more it feels like that truth is connected to something they've carried alone for far too long. Something that explains more than you realized. Something that changes the way certain events are viewed. And as these cards continue opening up, I can't help but notice another energy forming around the edges of the spread. An energy that feels less focused on explanations and more focused on choice. Because after the truth is spoken, after the silence is finally broken, another question still remains unanswered. What happens when someone stops looking backward and finally decides where they want to go from here? A different energy begins to emerge here. Less focused on questions, less focused on uncertainty, more focused on what happens when someone finally stops running from their own heart. The Chariot is the first card pulling my attention, and immediately I feel movement. Not chaotic movement, not impulsive movement, intentional movement. The kind that happens after a person has spent a long time wrestling with themselves and finally reaches a point where standing still feels heavier than moving forward. I keep getting the feeling that this person has been living inside a state of hesitation for much longer than anyone realizes. Not because they lacked feelings, not because they didn't care, because every major choice seemed connected to another choice. Every decision seemed connected to another consequence. And for someone who has spent so much time worrying about outcomes, that can become exhausting. But something feels different now. There's a calm determination around this energy, almost like they're no longer asking themselves whether they should listen to their heart. They're beginning to ask what happens if they don't. And honestly, that question seems to be changing everything. Because once a person starts imagining life without the opportunities they've been, avoiding, the perspective shifts. The focus moves away from fear. The focus moves toward value, toward what actually matters, toward what they might regret losing. What stands out to me is that they don't seem interested in temporary solutions anymore. The cards feel surprisingly mature, surprisingly grounded, almost like they're looking beyond emotional highs and focusing on what can actually last. The Four of Wands appears here, and I immediately feel a desire for stability. Not perfection, not fantasy, stability, comfort, peace. The ability to relax and stop carrying emotional armor everywhere they go. You know, I think there was a period where this person believed freedom meant keeping their options open, keeping doors unlocked, never becoming too attached, never becoming too vulnerable. But the longer they lived that way, the more disconnected they felt. Because freedom without connection eventually starts feeling empty. And I think they're beginning to understand that. The cards keep showing someone who wants to feel settled inside themselves. Someone who wants to build rather than wander. Someone who wants to stop looking over their shoulder wondering if they made the wrong choice. For some of you, this realization arrives quietly. For others, it arrives all at once. But regardless of how it happens, I keep seeing this person becoming increasingly aware of what brings genuine peace into their life. And Aries, your energy keeps appearing inside that realization. Not because you're forcing your way into their thoughts. Not because you're demanding their attention. Because when they imagine authenticity, your presence naturally appears alongside it. The Six of Pentacles enters the spread, and the atmosphere softens. There's something very sincere about this card in this position, because what I'm noticing isn't somebody focused on what they can receive. It's somebody thinking about what they can finally give. That feels important, very important, because for a long time, the balance may not have felt equal. There may have been moments when one person carried more emotional weight than the other. Moments when understanding wasn't fully reciprocated. Moments when effort wasn't always matched. The cards aren't showing blame, they're showing awareness. Awareness creates change. And this person seems increasingly aware of things they couldn't fully recognize before. I keep hearing the words, I want to do this differently. Not perfectly, differently, more honestly, more openly, more intentionally. The energy feels less concerned with appearances and more concerned with substance. Less concerned with what things look like from the outside and more concerned with how they actually feel. And that's a major shift, because once people begin valuing authenticity over image, Many of their previous fears lose power. Okay, the Ten of Pentacles appears, and the first thing I notice is how much calmer the energy becomes, almost as if the noise starts fading away. The opinions, the distractions, the uncertainty, the endless mental calculations, all of it begins moving into the background. What remains is surprisingly simple. What kind of life do I actually want? Who do I want standing beside me while I'm building it? Who do I trust? Who do I feel safe being myself around? Who sees me clearly? Those questions keep surrounding this card, and I don't think this person can avoid them anymore. Not because anyone is forcing them to answer, because the answers have been becoming clearer with time. There's something incredibly human about this energy. It's not dramatic. It's not about grand declarations. It's about someone recognizing the difference between temporary excitement and lasting significance. The difference between attention and connection. The difference between convenience and meaning. And I feel like they're looking at Aries through that lens now. Not through assumptions. Not through fear. Not through confusion. Through experience. Through reflection. Through everything they've learned along the way. The Chariot keeps drawing my eye again, which tells me this process isn't only happening internally. Something is aligning between thought and action, between realization and decision, between understanding and movement. I keep getting this image of someone standing at a crossroads they once feared. Only now the crossroads doesn't feel frightening, it feels necessary, because remaining in limbo has become its own burden. And the strange thing is, I don't think the biggest question on their mind anymore is whether they care. I think they've already confronted that answer. The bigger question seems to be what they're willing to leave behind in order to move toward what matters most. Because as these cards continue unfolding, I can feel another chapter beginning to open. One that feels less focused on inner realization and more focused on what happens when choices begin creating real-world consequences. And that's where the energy starts getting even more interesting. So Aries, as these cards settle, what stays with me isn't fear, confusion, or even uncertainty. It's the feeling of someone finally becoming honest with themselves. Someone who spent a long time questioning their heart, only to realize that some answers never really left them. And maybe that's what this journey has been about all along. Not forcing anything, not chasing anything, just seeing things clearly enough to recognize what truly matters. Whatever part of this message resonated with you, allow it to sit with you for a little while. Sometimes understanding arrives quietly, sometimes it unfolds one layer at a time. And sometimes the biggest shifts begin the moment someone stops running from the truth they've been carrying all along. That's all I've got for you for this reading. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I truly appreciate each and every one of you. You all mean a lot to me. Take care of yourselves, keep following your own path, and I'll catch you in the next one. Okay, bye-bye.